Welcome, everyone. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. Welcome to another online edition of the OHC's regular Work in Progress talks, presentations given by faculty and graduate students who are current research fellows at the Oregon Humanities Center about their research projects. If you have questions at the end of the talk, please use the chat feature of Zoom. I will moderate and ask the questions. We've also enabled the closed captioning function of Zoom. You can activate captions using the live transcript option. The talk is being recorded and will be available for viewing later today on the Oregon Humanities Center's website and YouTube channel. Before introducing today's speaker, I also wanted to share news of an upcoming lecture sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center and the University of Oregon's Physics Department. Brown University physicist and president of the National Society of Black Physicists, Stefan Alexander, will give a talk titled "What a Scientist Learned from Jazz About Innovation" on Thursday, April 22nd at 4 p.m. live via Zoom. That's Pacific time. You can register for that lecture through the OHC's website at ohc.uoregon.edu. I'm pleased now to introduce our speaker for today, Daniel Gómez Steinhart, Associate Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Oregon. He is a 2020-2021 OHC Faculty Research Fellow. Professor Steinhart's interests lie in the art and industry of cinema and media. His research and teaching focuses on global Hollywood, production studies, film aesthetics, independent film, and contemporary international art cinema. Steinhart's first book, Runaway Hollywood, Internationalizing Post-War Production and Locations Shooting, published by the University of California Press in 2019, examines how Hollywood created a globalized production industry from the late 40s to the early 60s, and how Hollywood filmmakers confronted the challenges of foreign location shooting. Steinhart's follow-up book project studies the history of Hollywood productions in Mexico from the early 40s to the late 60s. His work in progress talk, a part of that book project, is titled Crossborder Hollywood, Excavating the Production of Catch-22 in Mexico. Welcome, Daniel. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Paul. So let me share my screen. First, I just want to give a big thanks to the Oregon Humanities Center for its support. And I want to thank Paul, Jenna, Melissa, Peg, and the rest of the staff, as well as the advisory board for supporting my research. 1 year into the pandemic, it's a real luxury to be able to have the time and just the psychic space to be able to focus on research. But I'll admit that, this has also been a challenge working on a book project that relies on archival research when I haven't been able to go to an archive in about 2 years. It was, I think, 2 summers ago that I last did research in an archive. But I tend to sort of be a pack rat when I go to archives. I will gather a bunch of materials, file them away, and I won't look at them until I start writing. So this has actually been a good chance to just figure out what I do have, what I can do with it, and then also to try to do research remotely. So I hope that some of today's talk will reflect that work. And just to clarify, I know there's maybe a couple different titles. Today's talk is excavating the production of Catch-22 in Mexico, and the larger book is looking really at Hollywood productions in Mexico. So with that said, I want to start out with this image. Along the Mexican coast of the Gulf of California, just north of the port town of Guaymas, lies a swath of land with the sea on one side and mountains on the other. Down on the ground, a neglected road bisects the stark desert landscape of dirt and sage plants. This is the traditional indigenous homeland of the Yaqui people. If we zoom back out a bit, we see that this road is part of a larger network of roadways and a long cement strip. These are the remains not of a derelict civic project, but of a movie set, the Paramount production of Catch-22, which was filmed in 1969. The story behind these cinematic ruins is the tale of how a Hollywood film company went to Mexico to undertake a multi-million-dollar motion picture. The production, which failed commercially, is also something of a cautionary tale. Coming at the end of the 1960s, Catch-22 marked nearly 2.5 decades of Hollywood's post-war productions in Mexico, which became one of the most active centers for Hollywood filmmaking outside the United States. So why was Mexico such an attractive location to Hollywood? There was the geographic proximity to Los Angeles, a skilled Mexican workforce, lower production costs, and a diversity of landscapes. There was also the support of an infrastructure that Hollywood had been investing in since World War II, namely Estudios Churubusco, which Hollywood studio RKO and some US industrialists had an important role in building. So all of these were compelling reasons for Hollywood movie producers to export production to Mexico. And the subject of my current book project, which is tentatively titled Cross-Border Hollywood: Production Politics and Practices in Mexico, explores these reasons and also how Hollywood was able to export production to Mexico from 1945 to 1970. So I'm going to take a little detour from Catch-22 to talk about the inspiration for this book, give you a brief overview of the project, and then I will come back to Catch-22. So Cross-Border Hollywood is really a follow-up to my first book, Runaway Hollywood. And this first book focused on the period 1948 to 1962, when Hollywood was really building up its global production operation. And for this book, I focused on the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. And I was pursuing a series of research questions, but one of the basic research questions I was interested in is how many Hollywood films were shot abroad. And so to try to figure this out, I looked to the American Film Institute catalog, which is a database of feature films. And I discovered that from 1948 to 1962, Hollywood companies released 563 films where some portion of principal photography was done abroad. And so even though this is a provisional count, it certainly points to a robust trend. And these findings also show that the productions were far-reaching geographically. Certainly a lot of productions were done in the United Kingdom, France, and Italy, which is why I focused on those locations, but also yet a lot of productions done in Japan, Kenya, and territories like Puerto Rico. And then, dozens of other countries where Hollywood films were shot were in the single digits. And so one thing that certainly stood out to me was Mexico, which for this period hosted 76 Hollywood productions. And so I was interested in why this was. So for this new project, I've expanded the timeline or the time frame from 1945 to 1970, and I've gone back to the American Film Institute catalog to determine that Hollywood filmed roughly 135 English language movies in Mexico, from Republic's Song of Mexico in 1945 to Paramount Studios' Catch-22 in 1970. So in exploring this period, I have broken this book up into 4 sections based around 4 broad themes. And so let me briefly go through these different sections. So the first section looks at how Hollywood exported production to Mexico. And it really picks up at a moment in time when Hollywood pivoted from this diplomatic wartime alliance that it had with Mexico, partly shaped by the Good Neighbor policy, into a production plan. And so I look at some of the key players, the key studio facilities, and craft practices that really facilitated this move to Mexico. The second section looks at how the Mexican film industry handled this influx of Hollywood studios through a mixture of cooperation and resistance. So I look at some key Mexican collaborators like technicians who were able to synthesize Mexican and Hollywood styles. I also considered the role of Mexican unions who tried to enforce rules on Hollywood productions. I also considered the role of Mexican censors who were often on the sets of Hollywood productions to supervise the depiction of Mexico and Mexicans. The third section looks at how Hollywood unions voiced some of their most fervent outcries against the offshoring of production to Mexico. And this was in part because some of these films were shot in Mexico, but set in the United States, which kind of just revealed to unions that Hollywood was going to Mexico primarily for financial reasons. In the end, these protests met with mixed results, but I think that these runaway productions really helped establish Mexico as this kind of malleable space that could meet the needs of Hollywood filmmakers. So this leads to the fourth and final section, the infrastructure of production, which looks at how Hollywood's operations in Mexico dovetailed with Mexico's goals of developing infrastructure. And I'm looking at three locations, the coastal city of Puerto Vallarta, the state of Durango, and the port city of Guaymas. So I conclude the book with a case study of Catch-22 to understand how Paramount's need to transform this location in Guaymas into this massive set also met the local needs to build up infrastructure. And as I hope to show, there are some ecological ramifications to those decisions. So let me share some of the conceptual frameworks I'm trying to think through for this section on infrastructure. In media studies, I think there's been this recent material turn to thinking about the infrastructure that supports the distribution of media. So examining things like server farms or undersea cable networks. And I find that this work very inspiring for looking at the infrastructure in my book. I'm interested not so much in the infrastructure that facilitates the distribution of media, but infrastructure that supports the production of media. And in particular, I'm interested in things like how construction and transportation networks are central to production work in terms of logistics, but also in terms of aesthetics. The other thing I've been thinking about is scale. And I think this is an opportunity to think about the scale of a global production process. So when Hollywood went abroad, it worked on a variety of scales, a transnational scale, a national scale, a local scale. I think it's also scalable in terms of its interactions with foreign private enterprises, US multinational enterprises abroad, and state-supported foreign enterprises. So on a production like Catch-22, this looks like how Catch-22 was relying on the US-Mexico Transborder Railway. It was getting support from the Mexican Department of Defense. It was working with the mayor of Guaymas. It was relying on a construction company, Constructora Ora. It was also looking to the multinational company DuPont and its explosives factories. And it was also coordinating with Estudios Churubusco in Mexico City, which at this point was state-run. And in thinking about scale, I want to engage with what Laura Isabel Serna calls, quote, the goal of pushing against the entrenched habit of privileging the nation so we understand how cinema moved historically across a variety of geographical scales. So in thinking about some of these frameworks, I want to return to Catch-22, which again is the case study that ends my book. And I'm still researching this book, and I'm just starting to write it. And I know maybe it's a little unorthodox to start at the end, but I'm hoping that by starting at the end, I will have kind of a sense of where the narrative trajectory of the book is going. So, okay, I know that was a long way to walk back to Catch-22, but let me go back to this case study. So Catch-22, which was filmed in Guaymas, Rome, and Paramount's Hollywood studios, exemplifies the kind of global productions that Hollywood had been investing in since the end of World War II. The movie also illustrates the benefits that south of the border productions could bring to both US and Mexican interests, though those benefits were far from mutual. So with this case study of Catch-22, I argue that Hollywood's global power, like US state power, worked on a variety of levels. On a broad level, Hollywood studios sought to minimize labor costs and maximize production values. On a practical level, Hollywood filmmakers adapted to the vested interests of Mexican officials, especially in terms of the building up of infrastructure, as long as those studio goals of savings and production values were met. The case of Catch-22 also reveals the ways that Hollywood could exploit longstanding US investments in trade, transportation, politics, and business in Mexico. In effect, Hollywood's global power is built on US power. Published in 1962, Joseph Heller's World War II novel Catch-22 follows US Captain John Yossarian, a B-25 bombardier. Most of the story is set on a US Air Force base on the Mediterranean island of Pianosa. The independent film and television company Filmways purchased the rights to Catch-22 and established the project at Paramount Studios with Mike Nichols set to direct. And at this point, Mike Nichols was coming off of the success of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and he was about to release The Graduate, which would go on to become a big hit. In 1968, Nichols traveled to Italy to scout locations along with production designer Richard Silbert and Filmways producer John Calley. They visited Rome, Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily in search of a locale that could replicate the novel's airbase setting, with a landing strip leading out to the sea and mountains set several miles back. But the survey team was unable to find a locale that was undeveloped enough to replicate a Mediterranean landscape of the early 1940s. Too many factories and oil dumps, complained production designer Silbert. The production would end up using authentic locations in Rome and also sets at nearby Dino De Laurentiis studio. But if the filmmakers needed to build an airbase from scratch, they required a location closer to Hollywood. It was on a location scout in Mexico that Silbert and producer John Calley found the ideal locale north of Guaymas, a dry Mediterranean-like landscape with the sea on one side and mountains set 2 miles back. Using Mexico as a stand-in for another location followed one option for Hollywood's global productions, but the decision risked angering Hollywood unions, which would call such films runaway productions, for evading the employment of US workers to cut costs. As I mentioned, some of Hollywood unions' most impassioned protests against the offshoring of production arose with films such as Sitting Bull and Daniel Boone Trailblazer, which were shot in Mexico but set in the United States. For unions, these productions were barefaced attempts to cash in on the less expensive labor in neighboring Mexico. With Catch-22, the protest was muted. Producers could justify shooting in Rome by appealing to notions of authenticity, even though the production did rely on studio work at the Dino De Laurentiis studio. They could appease Hollywood unions by filming front projection process shots at Paramount Studios and relying on local crews. They could also send many Hollywood crew members to Mexico to balance out the Mexican crew and fulfill long-running union demands to take more Hollywood personnel abroad. Moreover, the debates about runaway productions had lost momentum by the 1960s, becoming really a given for how most productions were conducted. In fact, Catch-22's producer Martin Ransohoff openly referred to films like Catch-22 not as runaway productions, but chase-away films, suggesting that producers were being chased out of Los Angeles due to prohibitive expenses. In Guaymas, the film's producers found not only lower costs, but also a location that was malleable. While Hollywood had gone to overseas locations for authenticity, filmmakers were increasingly attracted to stand-in spaces. As Ben Goldsmith and the late Tom O'Regan suggest, quote, "The built and natural environment of a place are valued as much for what they can stand in for, what they can be bent, reshaped to represent, as they are valued for themselves." This impulse to apply a kind of studio logic to real places had always existed in cinema with some ecological ramifications. And to illustrate this point, I want to show you a clip from Buster Keaton's The General, which might be familiar to some of you because it was shot here in Oregon. In describing the world-building ambitions of early studio filmmakers, Brian Jacobson explains that, quote, "Filmmakers looked on natural landscapes with studio eyes, reimagining what could be termed locations as potential sets that could be mined and extracted to generate cinema's human-built virtual worlds." So building on this tradition, the Catch-22 filmmakers approached the Guaymas locale as a resource-rich space to exploit in order to replicate the conditions of the studio world. At the same time, this approach to locations also reflected the ways that the US film industry was changing as conglomerates bought up Hollywood studios in the late 1960s and sold off their backlots, which had long supplied film shoots with reusable sets. In their place, a terraforming approach to working on locations prevailed. Reshaping the environment meant building an Air Force base and runway from the ground up. Since the location was only accessible by boat, the production had to build a road. To help execute this work, Paramount found a willing partner in the mayor of Guaymas, Oscar Ruiz Almeida, who recognized the financial investment the studio could bring to his town. As it turned out, the mayor, who had his own contracting company, also saw a good business opportunity. One of the tasks of the construction operation was to obtain permission from the owners of three properties where the runway and road would be built. And I've tried to kind of reconstruct these three different properties based on some land access agreements and correspondence, and trying to map that information onto this satellite image. The film's seaside runway would be located on the most picturesque spot, Los Algodones property. To the southeast lay El Baviso property, where the road would connect the production to hotels in the Guaymas subdivision of San Carlos. To join these two tracks, the road would have to pass through the San Carlos property, owned by Antonio Bermudez, a prominent politician and industrialist. Bermudez had studied in the United States before running a whiskey operation in Ciudad Juarez during Prohibition, then becoming mayor of the border city and eventually taking on the directorship of the state oil firm Pemex. These land negotiations built on the transnational links that were already in place between the United States and Mexico's landholding elites. All three property owners gave the film production permission to build on their land for free. In return, Paramount promised to leave the road, runway, and buildings in good condition to, quote, increase the value of the property, unquote. In the negotiations with Bermudez, production manager Jack Korick assured the industrialist that Paramount would hire as many Mexican workers as possible and spend generously on property construction. The one demand that Paramount made to the owners was to not permit other film companies to shoot on the properties until 1 year after the release of Catch-22. In the global competition for locations, a premium was put on cinematic spaces where which Paramount wanted exclusive control of. So with the land secured, Guaymas Mayor Ruiz Almeida and his contracting company moved forward on the construction of the 5-mile 2-lane road and 6,000-foot runway. Dozens of laborers used machetes to clear the land of brush and cacti while preserving mesquite trees that vaguely look like Italian olive trees. Further construction including installing pipelines, telephone lines, electrical lines, and a sewage system. The runway required 10,000 tons of asphalt, which were to be produced at a plant in nearby Ciudad Obregón. Taking advantage of an economy of scale, Ruiz Almeida arranged to use the same plant to produce asphalt for both the Catch-22 job and also for repaving the Guaymas airport. It was one of several instances when the mayor's support of the production also supported the infrastructure of Guaymas while strengthening his contracting company. The work of constructing the runway was a feat of geology and engineering that required the creation of a surface that could support 12-ton B-25 bombers. For guidance on this project, Paramount turned to the Griffith Company, a contractor based in Orange County that since its founding in 1902 had helped build up Southern California's infrastructure from air bases and airports to dams and highways. District Manager George P. Griffith, a third-generation Griffith contractor, helped the studio evaluate Ruiz Almeida's work. During one site visit to Guaymas, Griffith made clear that his role was to protect Paramount's bottom line. When shown that additional work was done beyond what was contracted, such as widening the road to make it safer, Griffith advised that such improvements were of little value to Paramount and to decline payment. When he saw that pipes for stream crossings were installed to avoid flooding, Griffith told the studio, quote, "The pipes add to the permanency of the road, but are of no advantage to you since you will be finished before the rainy season comes." Despite Paramount's many assurances that the construction work would enhance the property's values, the studio was primarily concerned with what would be beneficial to the production only during filming, not with the permanence of the area's infrastructure. In the end, construction expenses would greatly add to the film's ballooning budget, which by the end of production ranged from $15 to $20 million in total costs, which was a huge amount of money at that time. While the runway and the surrounding sets fulfilled story requirements, they also met logistical needs. The production could use the airstrip to transport personnel and equipment to and from Los Angeles. Exposed footage was also flown to Los Angeles, where it was processed at Paramount's lab to generate dailies. The relatively short distance between the Mexican location and Paramount points to the geographic advantage of working in Mexico rather than Europe, which was the site of many Hollywood productions in the post-war era. Given the scale of the location shoot, the production had to look to a more extensive transportation network. To deliver military vehicles, props, and equipment, Paramount packed 28 freight cars that followed the Southern Pacific Railway from Los Angeles to Nogales, Arizona. The freight cars crossed the border and continued along the Sonora Railway that linked the US borderlands to Guaymas. As the first transborder railway, the Sonoran line to Guaymas had long been a strategic route for the United States, giving it access to Pacific trade and travel. It also helped make Guaymas into a travel and business destination. A 1940s train car menu from the Southern Pacific Railway, which had purchased the Sonora line, highlighted Guaymas's Playa de Cortez Hotel, built by the US Railroad Company in 1936. A 1947 edition of Terry's Guide to Mexico, which was basically a tourist guide to Mexico, further made the point, quote, since the coming of the railway, and particularly since the opening of the alluring Playa de Cortez, Guaymas has burgeoned into one of the great tourist resorts of Mexico, unquote. The hotel would end up serving as a production office for Catch-22 and the primary accommodation for the film's stars. Building on this history, Hollywood's cross-border reach was predicated on the United States' growing control of North American trade and transportation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. With Paramount exporting to Mexico enough military weapons, vehicles, and arms to carry out a small invasion, the studio needed approval from Mexico's Department of Defense. So production manager Jack Horrick wrote to its defense minister, General Marcelino Garcia Barragan, to explain that the production would be using warplanes and arms brought from the United States. The approval eventually arrived in September of 1968 from the Defense Department's General Mario Ballesteros Prieto on the condition that the Mexican military stay informed of the entry and exit of the equipment and that it not be used more than 10 kilometers from the coast. Now, the support from the National Defense Department came at a time of civil unrest when Mexican authorities were attempting to control protests against the government in the lead up to the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. As a longtime supporter of the PRI or PRI administration, the CIA and Pentagon were at the time covertly supplying the Mexican government with military weapons and riot training. The protests reached their culmination on October 2nd, when the Mexican armed forces opened fire on an unarmed crowd of protesters, killing hundreds of civilians in what became known as the Tlatelolco massacre. Future investigations would show that Defense Minister Garcia Barragan, whom Paramount sought approval from, signed the order to install snipers on rooftops. National security documents also revealed that General Ballesteros, who approved Catch-22's military importation, was second in command of the task force created to quell the unrest. He would also ignore orders to keep troops out of the area where the massacre unfolded. In a cruel twist of irony, the United States' support of Mexico's military crackdown occurred at the same time that Mexico was supporting Catch-22, an anti-war movie that depicted a fictitious military operation. Even against a troubling backdrop of violence, Hollywood benefited from the US support of a corrupt Mexican regime. With the construction complete and permissions obtained, principal photography commenced in January of 1969. The high-profile production drew a lot of press attention. Paramount put on a press junket in which journalists flew in to visit the set. Many of them, including journalist and future filmmaker Nora Ephron, depicted set life as something of a lark. A bunch of Hollywood comedians stuck in the Sonoran Desert, passing the time by playing practical jokes. At night, the cast and crew hung out in the bar at the Playa de Cortez Hotel and watched film prints flown down from Los Angeles. Later accounts would describe the rampant drug use amongst the cast and crew. Despite what came off as a swashbuckling film shoot and press stories, there were some low points. The producers fired 200 extras from Mexico and the United States when director Mike Nichols felt that the crowded backgrounds made the film look too much like a conventional Air Force picture. When the newly barren army base while the newly barren army base achieved the dreamlike limbo the director was after, the firing of Mexican workers undercut the production's dedication to local investment. The infrastructure of the runway and the surrounding buildings provided both logistical support and aesthetic choices during shooting. The filmmakers could create a dynamic interplay between the real and the fabricated. The natural landscape in the background could be used as a visual anchor to the sets and actors in the foreground. The built landscape could enhance a striking sense of depth through a recessional sweep across the widescreen frame. And instead of recreating indoor settings on Hollywood sound stages, the production constructed some of its interiors on location. This decision not only made a company move from outside to inside more efficient, but it also allowed for a precise choreography of exteriors and interiors. In one sequence, British cinematographer David Watkin coordinated a real sunset with the dimming light of a hospital room. By blending real and built environments, the filmmakers implemented a studio aesthetic to the location. But on a soundstage, the sets could be torn down and repurposed. Here on the location, these sets were blown to bits, which undermined the production's pledge to leave the buildings intact to enhance the property value. To pull off the film's air raids, the production had to secure dynamite. So Paramount turned to the Mexican branch of the US chemical company DuPont. With roots in gunpowder manufacturing in the 19th century, DuPont was able to produce the dynamite at its explosives plant in Mexico City. Originally, the plant was part of DuPont's Mexican subsidiary, Compañía Mexicana de Explosivos. But in the 1960s, it was fully absorbed into DuPont's Mexican operations. Once again, the globalization of US businesses proved to be a boon to Hollywood's runaway productions. The Catch-22 crew planned to conduct an additional simulated bomb drop off the coast of Guaymas. But Mexico's Department of Fishing and Industry became concerned that detonating dynamite in the water would impact the ecosystem of Guaymas Bay. The production attempted to convince fishing officials by explaining that this kind of simulation had been done many times along the California coast with no negative results. Not surprisingly, the fishing department denied the request on the grounds that the explosives would be harmful to marine life. What is surprising is that 2 months later, the second unit film crew received approval to detonate the explosives in a cove up the coast. Perhaps further from the port of Guaymas, there was less concern with the explosives' effect on the area's lucrative fishing industry. Whatever the reason, the result on screen leaves an indelible image that invokes an insight from writer Nadia Bozak. Quote, "Embedded in every moving image is a complex set of environmental relations," unquote. It's also an image that fulfills the kind of spectacle that Hollywood specialized in. But the appeal of big budget spectacle films was quickly fading in Hollywood, which by the late 1960s was suffering a financial slump with few hits and many failures. Catch-22 would be one of those failures, earning mixed reviews and poor box office results. The film had been put into production shortly after the merger of Paramount and the conglomerate Gulf and Western, which was a company primarily known for auto parts supplies. Gulf and Western was moving to streamline the studio by slashing overhead and focusing on lower budgeted films such as Rosemary's Baby and Love Story. Meanwhile, Catch-22, which was shot in 3 different countries with a large cast and crew, was looking like a relic of the old Hollywood studio system. The folly of Catch-22 seemed to be summed up best by this March 1971 cover of Mad Magazine. The influence of Catch-22 in Mexico was mixed. In the coming years, tourism in Guaymas would grow as a result of local investment in hotels and infrastructure. The press coverage of Catch-22 played a minor role, with the subdivision of San Carlos developing into a community of US immigrants. The greatest Mexican beneficiary of the production was Guaymas mayor, Oscar Ruiz Almeda, who grew rich from Paramount's investments. But his life would take a dark turn. One day, his body was found in a sports facility in Chihuahua. His death was initially reported as suicide, but rumors swirled about debts owed and corruption scandals. The mystery of his death would be the subject of a 1994 documentary, The Devil Never Sleeps, made by his niece, Chicana filmmaker Lourdes Portillo. It's fitting that Ruiz Almeida's legacy would live on cinematically. That legacy is also intertwined in the vestiges of Catch-22 in Guaymas, which shed light on the repercussions of Hollywood's production in Mexico. If Catch-22's airstrip and buildings lay in ruins, what do we make of Paramount's promise about the benefit for the land and local communities? It should remind us that Hollywood's global production goals were to minimize costs and maximize production values, sometimes at the expense of the long-term advantages to local communities. The movie ruins of Catch-22 are evidence of this industry logic. So that's it.
Thanks so much, Daniel, for that fascinating talk. And I now would invite people to share their questions in the chat. We've already got a couple. I'll ask them to Daniel now. So both of these questions come from Tim Williams, who's a professor of history in the Clark Honors College. So the first question is going back to those initial graphs of the numbers of films that were made outside of the United States. What accounts for the high peak of movies produced in Mexico in 1956?
So that's a great question, and good to see you, Tim. I guess I will preface it by saying I don't think I've figured that out just yet. I think I'm still early in trying to analyze those numbers. I will say that it reflects the trend lines in sort of the greater phenomenon of Hollywood productions abroad, which were starting to peak in the sort of mid to late 1950s. And so, I think my hunch is probably it reflects the overall trend of Hollywood really starting to invest more in global productions. And I think, by this time, Hollywood has had about a decade in Mexico to kind of figure out how to make these movies. So I think there was some momentum building. I think the trend line starts to go down after that because of some tensions with working in Mexico. There's a lot of accusations of price gouging from the Mexican film industry, which I think dissuaded certain Hollywood producers from working in Mexico. This started to change a little bit later on in the 1960s when places like the state of Durango was really starting to try to attract Hollywood production, in particular to make Westerns there. And then so the productions start to increase by the late 1960s, and that continues somewhat into the 70s, even though, by the early 70s, Hollywood is going through somewhat of a kind of economic depression and starts to scale things back. But yeah, I appreciate that question, and I think I kind of need more time to analyze some of those numbers.
So Tim's second question is, he's really interested in the composition of an archive for a project like yours, Daniel. What sources have been most useful or intriguing?
So great question, and something I'm thinking about a lot and sort of longing for to get back to the archives. I'm lucky to be a historian of Hollywood, which has amazing archive resources, primarily in Los Angeles. Probably the place I've done most of my research is at the Margaret Herrick Library, which is run by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, which had a production file of Catch-22 because they have the studio records for Paramount. And I was actually surprised that they had so much information, because as the studios start to break up into the 1960s, it becomes harder and harder to find records for films in the 60s and certainly into the 70s. But I found a good amount of information. And this is balanced by some other film archives at UCLA, USC, the Warner Brothers Archive at USC. But I've also looked at the National Archives, NARA in Maryland, and the State Department files, which I think has given me a good sense of the diplomatic relations between Hollywood and the Mexican industry. And then that is sort of being balanced by, I think, a kind of range of sources like tourist guidebooks and kind of ephemera to give me a sense of the relationship between the United States and Mexico during this period. The big gap that I have right now is archive work in Mexico, which I haven't been able to do, and I'm very eager to go there, both to visit locations, but also look at archival work there. But my sense is that it's going to be hard to find a lot of good industry archive information there. And this is kind of based on trying to do archival research in Europe, which doesn't have as robust records of production. Even though, around the world, there's all these great studios, they don't necessarily have great studio records. So that can be harder to find. So, there's always just like a really great kind of paper trail in these U.S. film archives to follow. And, I think a lot of the narrative just comes through, looking at those U.S. Film archive records. But, I think for me, it's really important to get the Mexican perspective on this. So I am eager to go down there.
So the next question comes from Michael Allen. He'd love to hear more about the exemplarity of Guaymas in the history of such productions abroad. Are the negotiations paradigmatic of what occurs at other sites, or is Mexico somehow unique? Michael's thinking, for example, of the extensive location shooting done north of the border in British Columbia.
Yeah, that's a great question. Is it exemplary? I mean, it's exemplary, yeah, because it's bordering the United States, and so it's good that you're raising Canada, which really was not a sort of a primary location until I think the 1980s and especially in the 1990s, when there's a lot of film and TV production going to Canada. So, Mexico, I think, was important because of its geographic proximity, especially to Los Angeles. So, I think that sort of geographical distance is important. I think there's a certain geopolitical history that it's building on during World War II and the good neighbor policy and the sort of alliance that it's building, and a lot of the investment that both the government in the United States and the U.S. film industry was making in terms of the Mexican film industry. And, they were supporting the Mexican industry in part so that, for propagandistic reasons, but it was also building this infrastructure that then Hollywood could really exploit after the war. So I think that's some of that kind of geopolitical context. But, in terms of the locations, there are parts of Mexico that certainly resemble the geography of Southern California, which was one of the reasons why there were, well, in part, one of the reasons why the Hollywood industry sort of emerged in Southern California was the diversity of locations. So, I think the space itself was really important for Hollywood to be able to carry out a range of genres. Right? And Hollywood is a genre industry. You could make war films, you could make treasure hunt movies, and certainly Westerns. And I'd say of any genre, it was mostly a place of Westerns. But I am interested in kind of, the way that Mexico serves as this space that kind of Hollywood could exploit and extract its resources to carry out its productions. And I think the location of Guaymas served that purpose. Yeah, thanks for the question, Mike.
So Sangeeta Gokpal is asking to unmute. Can you do that, Sangeeta? Can you unmute yourself? I don't know if you can. See if you can now.
I'm unmuted.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was a very, very interesting talk, Danielle, and really rich in terms of the 4 areas that you are going to examine. I had a very unformed question between, say, which kind of builds off that last point that you were making, which is, let's say, the economic logic of runaway productions, and to what extent that intersects with, say, the ontological attributes of a location, right? Or the material attributes of a location. So, and then the third thing that you point to is how that's a ecology in Mexico that resembles the Southern Californian one, and therefore allows for certain types of genre films to be shot there more easily. How that drives I guess I'm wondering to what extent like that the drive for Runaway is also driven by the changing generic tastes of film history. Do you know what I mean? So, say with the rise of a certain, let's say, urban-based film, Mexico will no longer do. So I'm just kind of wondering whether there's a way to think about that, right? Like whether the economic logic, the political economy of Runaway Productions, how it combines or articulates with genre on the one hand, and what it needs to show, and spaces or ecologies on the other. So that was kind of my very unformed question. And then I specifically became interested. I don't know if you're familiar with a book by Priya Jaikumar called Where Histories Reside.
Yeah.
So if you are, I'm just kind of wondering, like, to what extent, like, the kind of work you're doing kind of intersects with the challenge that she issues to production culture of a sort of spatial historiography. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions, those thoughts. So I think if I understood sort of your first point, it was in part about sort of the logic of Runway Productions, and I think there's always this tension between the need for authenticity, going to a location to take advantage of its authenticity and spectacle, which became really important in the post-war era, in part to differentiate Hollywood films from television. But I think, one of the reasons why there was a lot of protest against the Hollywood films that were going to Mexico was that it wasn't just about authenticity. It was really about sort of a stand-in location, a space that could be kind of reconfigured to stand in for an Italian location in the case of Catch-22, or a setting in the United States. And so no longer could producers use sort of the authenticity argument as this sort of fig leaf for the real financial reasons of why producers were going to Mexico. And in terms of sort of the changing tastes of genre, I think the Western is really important here, and I think we can see the development of the Western after World War II becoming kind of a serious genre, and also a kind of genre of allegory. A lot of people like Richard Slotkin have talked about how the Mexico Western of the 1950s and 1960s is really an allegory for the kinds of US interventions that the United States was making around the world, especially in Southeast Asia. And so I think in that way, sort of the popularity of the Western is also intersecting with what was going on politically. And in terms of, Priya Jaikumar's work, which, I'm certainly, I think I've read the introduction of that book, and I've heard one of her talks, and I certainly find her work really inspiring. I think it really resonates with kind of what I'm trying to do in terms of centering space. I think my work is this balance of sort of production studies, interest in production cultures, but also thinking about how that's interacting with certain spatial questions, about location, but also the infrastructure of space, and the geopolitics of space. So yeah, I really kind of appreciate her intervention of, bringing in the importance of space into sort of the analysis of production. So I don't know, I hope I tried to address some of the things you talked about, but thanks for that.
So we have a question from Mason Kennedy, but Mason, I just want to look and tell me, because I think Daniel may have answered this question for you already. Yes, he did. Okay, so the next one, Daniel, you mentioned that there's been extensive scholarship on the infrastructure of the distribution of media, but your work is innovative in that it's particularly attending now to the infrastructure of production. And I'm just wondering where you got to at the end of your talk was sort of stepping back and sort of thinking a little more largely about that large question about the implications of the infrastructure of production in these runaway productions. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity, if there were, to speak a little bit more broadly about that question, and if you're able to at this point in your research, can you draw some broader conclusions about the larger implications of, in particular, the infrastructure that has remained after these productions?
Yeah. I think I'm still thinking through the issue of infrastructure, but and this was something that came up in my first book, and I do have a chapter about movie infrastructure, and really I talk about infrastructure in terms of the studios, the laboratories, the equipment houses that Hollywood was relying on in Europe. But there is always, for me, some sort of basic questions about infrastructure. For example, like in the post-war era in Europe, were Hollywood filmmakers able to communicate to their studios by phone? So I needed to understand what was that infrastructure like for telecommunication. Also, Hollywood was shipping a good amount of equipment overseas. How was that done? What were the shipping agencies that they were relying on? So I think there's always this question of infrastructure on my mind, and I think it's something I wanted to explore more in this book. And for me, I think that really came about in part just doing this case study of Catch-22, when it's just I think it's stuff that's easy to kind of gloss over because it can be really, really dry, thinking about the freight cars and the transportation of equipment. But I think it opens up kind of a larger history of U.S.-Mexico relations in terms of trade, in terms of transportation. I'm interested in sort of the remnants of this infrastructure. On the one hand, some of it remains. Certainly the movie infrastructure, Estudios Churubusco, is still the largest and most important studio in Mexico. But in terms of the location work, I think I was very struck by the fact that so much of the infrastructure for Catch-22 is largely in ruins. And I am eager to get down there to look at it in person, but I've had to kind of rely on travel photos that I can find online and sort of some satellite imagery on Google Earth. But I think it just raises a kind of a larger issue about sort of the ethics of runaway productions in terms of going to these locations and the kind of environmental impact that it has. And I think really Hollywood needs to be thoughtful about going into a place and having a small footprint. And I think there's a lot of discussion right now about sort of the environmental impact of media, both in sort of the scholarship of it, but also within the industry. So I think that sort of environmental, some of those ecological concerns connects to infrastructure as well.
So we've come to the end of our time, Daniel. There are no more questions in the chat. I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much for sharing this fascinating work and to thank everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it for coming.
For more information about the Oregon Humanities Center and our upcoming sponsored events, or if you'd like to contribute to supporting our research and public programs, go to ohc.uoregon.edu, and we will see you next time. Thanks so much.